talking about how to make comics.
My name is Bill Williams. I've lettered and worked with the Iconic Comics guys for a while. I've been making comics off and on for about 30 years. I've worked for big companies and small companies. And it just so happens, I made a comic book about how to make comics. Each page is a little lesson on how to make your comics better and faster and smarter.
Let's make sure we get the mics as close as we can.
I'm Eric July, founder and owner of Rippaverse Publishing, and I actually do have a book as well, less on the comics side, but more on the business side, called How to Build a Creative Business. And you can get that wherever you get your books. But talking about these unsexy stuff that people don't like to focus on, and that's just the logistics, the business side of things. So that's what I kind of zone in on, because there's just not a lot of material out there on it.
My name is Dunn. I'm the founder of Antarctic and I do comics.
All right, so let's start with the most simple, basic question. Please remember, guys, if you have some questions, we will definitely get to your questions. All right, so someone comes to you and says, I want to make a comic, I've got a script. What's the first step?
At least for me, I don't think there's always one way to do things, but I started with really laying out the foundation. It really depends on what your objective is. I wanted to build an entire universe with mine rather than just a one-off comic. So I started with my universe Bible, and I felt that I could not write, even if I had already scripted it, I could not have a believable story if I myself didn't understand the characters. So I built this universe Bible top to bottom before I actually got towards giving it to my artist in Cliff Richards. So really learning to understand who these characters are is so very, very vital. But outside of that, again, going to the unsexy stuff, I can talk to you about scripting and all of that stuff out, but it depends on what you're trying to do. Right? Is this a vanity project, or is it something you're trying to build a legitimate business on? And as I've been discussing time and time over this weekend, is you got to know who you're selling to. What is your target demographic? Who exactly is this book for? Is a question that you must be able to answer. Because if it's just for yourself, you may be running into some problems when it comes to actually putting that thing out.
I'll say, hey, how many pages is your project? You want to do short chapters that lead up to something? You want to try to write a graphic novel 8 pages at a time? How do you think you're going to produce this? Where you're going to put it? Digital, print, whatever? Have you checked for printers? I will get into the nuts and bolts of what form your story's going to take, and then work backwards from there. So it is really hard to tell Lord of the Rings in 6 pages. But you can tell one guy's story in Lord of the Rings in 6 pages and build on that. You just have to know what your capabilities are in terms of production.
Well, for me, the most important question is why? Why would you want to do a comic? It's not sort of a typical kind of occupation that you wake up one day and say, hey, I want to do a comic. To me, it's all about vision, and passion. If you want to you can do a comic. It's not, it's difficult. If you have the money, you just hire somebody to write or draw it. But for you personally, let's say you don't have a lot of money. How do you get started? Where do you get started? How do you get your comic into the hands of people? Those are all questions you have to ask yourself before you even begin your journey into the comic field or into the comic industry. So you have to ask yourself one basic question: do I want to do this? If the answer is yes, then, like these gentlemen here, they made the sacrifice they made. They worked hard to get to where they are, because they had a vision of what they wanted to do. So that has to apply to you. If you decide you wanted to get into comic books, is your idea good? Okay, that's the basic thing. Will people buy it? You know, are you doing it just for yourself in hopes that people will share your vision? You know, those are all very difficult and fundamental questions you have to, ask yourself before you jump into the deep end of the pool. You know, and these gentlemen here, they had a vision and they have passion. You know, those are two very important things, in my opinion, you have to have before you even begin, to start your journey into doing comics.
Awesome. All right, so let's start with a few questions. Who has a question? All right, coming to you.
So when you're developing the early stages of a story, what do you do if you have your characters figured out, but you aren't sure what story you're going to make with those characters, or the opposite, where you have a world or you have a story, but you don't know what characters are going to drive that story forward?
Man, that's such a good question. I think it's different for everybody. I'm a big character-driven guy, so for me, it's actually the opposite problem, where I will make the character and I have to find these sort of believable settings that I need to put them in, and obviously a believable or a story that can resonate, with people. But that's why I always refer to my universe Bible, because at least for me, I have a template, no joke, and it goes through kind of every single beat. And it doesn't mean that I need to write it at that given moment. But how I operate, and I think how many of us, if you're a creative person, you may get an idea while you're like showering or something like that. And so, you got to notate it and then go back to your like master doc and put it down. And that way, you can kind of really put everything into perspective so you can actually start building that story. But I wouldn't worry too much. If you don't have all the ideas and everything figured out like that second, it's okay. Oftentimes it takes a bit for that to kind of come to you. But I always start my universe Bible, and I have a template where I break down everything. Who is this family member? What's the motivations for this character? And if I can get that all kind of like seeped into my brain where I know it like the absolute back of my hand, then I can make a story that makes sense for that character. But also, again, you're putting it in this believable setting, which makes that story resonate with that audience or with that reader. But if you don't get the ideas all in one go, it'll come to you. It just may take some time.
So I do some of that, but I really make up a lot of stuff as I'm going along too, because I find that part of it a whole lot of fun. As a point, I got an offer to participate in a 3-page project this morning, and in the shower I'm thinking, oh, I know how this could work. I got back, I sat down, I wrote out 3 pages of dialogue, sent it over to the guy, and I said, hey, let's just get the point across. He goes, oh, this is awesome, you get it. Yeah, let's go do some art. So, I mean, once you do it long enough, it's like a muscle that you build up and you get better at it. But it helps to really know your characters and really be interested in your characters and find a way to put them in a dramatic situation where they have an internal issue and the exterior issues that they face mirror that inner conflict. And you find a way for them to work that out physically and sometimes just emotionally by admitting shortcomings or making up with somebody, or there's emotional and physical needs you get in these things, and they can both pay off.
Yes, I agree with everything that's been said so far. For me, the process is a little different. I basically start off with a premise, decide what kind of story would be interesting for other people to read. And then I start fleshing out what do I want to populate this story with? What kind of characters, do I feel would be interesting for other people to read? So your character has to resonate with other people as well as to yourself. If you're not willing to read the story about this character, then why would other people want to read the story about this character? And as far as stories, it depends on what your long-term goals are. Sometimes people write stories where there's a beginning, a middle, and a definite end. Okay, if you want to write a story with a definite end, by all means, that's great. But if you are doing a story of a character that you want to continue ongoing adventures, that last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, how old is Batman, right? 80 years old, right? And he's still doing new adventures even today. Because the premise of the character, is so simple, but yet complicated enough that it can continue evolving and changing as times go on. So it just depends on what you want to set out. What kind of story do you want to tell? Okay, that's the important thing. Eric was character driven. That's great because that means his characters can go on and on, as long as he wants to tell his stories. If he wants to do multi-generational stories with the same characters, he can do that. Okay, because that's the way he designed, his story and his world. So it really depends on you, the individual creator. What do you want to say? What are you trying to tell? What stories do you want, to share with people, and what characters do you want to populate?
So this is a question really specifically for Eric. When you say character-driven, what do you mean specifically by that for anyone who's not written before?
Yeah, so some people really they have a story that's kicking around kind of in their head, and they may jot it down, and from then, like, the subjects, it's not that they are unimportant, but it's like they just kind of plug it in, right? It's like I have this overall premise, this overall story, not necessarily a premise, more so it's like a full story that they want to tell, but they haven't quite developed the characters. Me, I developed the characters first, and again, I'm not telling anybody this is the quote-unquote right way to do it. It's just how I have found to be an effective storyteller is to know the character, learn the character, flesh out that character before I start telling that initial story. And that's, in doing so, for example, with ISOM, which is our first book that we had come out with for our universe, we start kind of in the middle of his journey. He had already retired as a hero, and really the first arc is dealing with him, like putting the suit back on. And so, I had already knew so much about him, and even as you were reading the story, you kind of pick up those bits and pieces, and that stuff was already fleshed out. And even though, obviously, so much of the stuff that never made it to the first book, or the second or the third book, but I already know and understand, so I know where I need to go. So for me, it's all about fleshing that character out in the greatest of details that I possibly can. Now, when I'm telling that story along the way, there are going to be characters that I create that need to help move kind of the story along that are relatively new. But at least the core characters to the story, before I ever jot down page one, panel one, I know so much about them. And so it makes the storytelling, at least for me, a lot easier.
So you know the ins and outs, the motivations of these characters, and then we're taking these characters, whatever their motivations are, whatever their family background, lifestyle situations are, and putting them in these situations, and then how do they respond to these situations? And that's kind of the focus that you built.
Right, and because we're a universe that focuses so much on continuity, because I have all that fleshed out, it makes that part of it easier, and it keeps me, I know where I have to go, or if I do something that's kind of out of line, that gets in the way of like our canon or our continuity, right? It keeps me in check, I guess, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's just my overall approach. And the crazy thing is, I know we have guys at the Rippaverse, they're the other way around. They're like, I have this greater concept. I want to create this, this character that's on like they're going to be on this planet, but it specifically needs to be this type of science fiction story. And so then they start plugging in characters after they built all that around. It's just not, for me, been like I can't really do. That's not that maybe I can't do it. It's just that I don't prefer to do it. So different strokes for different folks. And I think if you are an aspiring writer, you need to find what works for you, so you can be the most effective.
All right. Okay, let's take another question from the audience. Who else has a question? All right, coming to you. One and then two. All right, here you go.
When you're making the artwork, what are your favorite mediums to use? When you're making the artwork, what are your favorite mediums to use for it?
So I'm an inker. Somebody else breaks that ice before I get to it. And that ice is really broken when I get to the lettering stage. So I know people that will work entirely digitally. Matt Weldon will just sit down with a punchline page or two and rough everything in. and it looks good, and then he sits down with one of these little gel pens and magically draws everything and doesn't have to erase a damn thing. Whenever I'm drawing, I gotta have that eraser at hand because I make lots of mistakes because I take weird chances. Anyway, your medium is kind of what you're most comfortable with. So the interesting thing about that is you need to do something that's sort of permanent, but sort of fixable. So people that work digitally, they'll work in layers. If they have something they don't like, they will go up a layer and redraw it and solve their problems that way. If you're trying to fix things in acrylic paints, it's harder. If you're trying to fix things in oil paints, it's easier. There's a reason that you start out with the pencil stage in comics and then go to inks. The penciling's for the storytelling issues, and then the inks are all for getting your fine level of detail and expression in there.
For me personally, it's just paper and pen and ink, and that's it. You know, I mean, I'm an old school kind of guy. I prefer paper. I mean, I do use digital. If digital is what you're comfortable with, then by all means use that. You know, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just paper and pencil and ink. You know, and the good thing about comics is that the entry point is pretty low.
All right, second question coming over here.
Hello. So I actually do have a published work, so I have some experience from what I've learned. However, I have had such a big issue with the brightness from the monitor on my computer when I had to transfer it to my publisher. And so there's been back and forth on, because the brightness of your computer, there were some inconsistent colors on one of the backgrounds, and that was a big issue between me and the publisher. So, and I guess what also helped is that it was between a Mac and a Windows, our two different computers. So, what would you suggest for like how bright we need to have the monitor, and if you use CSP, I use Clip Studio Paint, what sort of ink would you recommend for comic book artists who adhere to that software?
Right, very technically specific questions.
So I work old school. I hire pencilers. I convert the images to blue lines in Illustrator. I letter the pages. I get everything done. All my stuff's in black and white. What I would suggest for your issue is probably find a way to come up with a preferred file format for your publisher and find a way to check out your work before you send it in. So I would recommend for that getting your files where you want them in terms of level of finish. And maybe even just take them down to Kinko's and print them out on a copier and see what they look like, and even see if they read right, see if there's light, see if there's dark, see if there's contrast, all the things that you're looking for. And maybe do like your first round of triage on your own work before it gets to your editor, because editors have a lot to do and they don't usually have a lot of patience to do a lot of stuff like that. So it's usually best to find a way to fix it on your end. And I don't really deal with monitor levels on that kind of stuff, but there's got to be a way you can calibrate this. And I would be tempted to say, hey Brock, how do you calibrate a monitor? And go from there, because it seems like you have all the right tools in place. You just need to sharpen them to fit what your editor needs.
All right. Anybody else? Another question. All right. Coming to one and then two.
Yeah, once again with questions about early development, one thing that I've struggled with as a writer and artist is in the early stage of developing a story, I'll have an idea, but I won't actually have a very clear roadmap of what the entire story is going to look like put together. So in your early stages of writing a story, how do you go about planning that sort of roadmap of what the story is going to be?
Well, at least for me, it entirely depends on the format. So I'll give you an example. We have like a floor for our comic books where the minimum, or the floor by the minimum is a 56-page book. And that's just for like our baseline issues. But we also release what we call Rippaverse, and they're short stories meant to kind of fill the market out for them. They're only like 15 pages. I don't write that story the same way that I write a single issue, right, or full issue. So I start there with the format, and once I know that, I can tailor make the actual story for that specific format. That way, in the first place, I don't really run into a lot of those issues, because not everything is universal. Like our first book, ISO #1, was a 96-page book. It might as well have been a graphic novel, as meaty as it was. But you don't approach that the same way that you would if I'm like, I did a book called Saoirse, right? It's a private investigator story. So it is a brand new character as well. So I'm having it was a great little test for me to try to convince the audience to get into the character, let you know what this character is about, and do that just in 15 pages. But that is what that specific medium kind of required. So you have to kind of really figure out and hone in on what is the format of this story. How many pages do you want this to be? At minimum, give yourself a floor. That way you have something to shoot for, and that may kind of help you out. You have to know. It's easier to know where to go when you know how many pages that you need to get there. Because if it's just open-ended, then yeah, you may never know where you land. And maybe that works for some people. If you don't have any structure there, maybe it being that open-ended will work for you. But if you for sure want to get the story done, you have to give yourself some guidelines of like, this is what I have to do, otherwise it'll never get done. And I'm pretty sure these guys have been doing a lot longer than I have, so I know Ben probably has some insight on that.
Well, let me ask you, what kind of story are you trying to do?
Honestly, not entirely sure.
Are you a writer or an artist, or both?
I'm mainly an artist, but I have tried my hand in writing. Usually it'll be a summary of a story, so an idea of main plot points, character relationships, maybe like a timeline of when things happen, and then I'll make art based on that story. So I do think that if it were like a comic book, then I think my question might have been a little more relevant, but it's still that sort of idea of how do I plan where I want the story to go. Again, sort of like a timeline. Because I have like a Google Doc that'll have like a series of events, but it's like, that's not rooted in anything. That's just me kind of winging it.
Well, my advice to you is just start at the beginning. Just sit down and say, this is how I'm going to start the story, okay? And see where it takes you from there. If you're writing a story, you already have a vision of what you want to do. For the most part, I think, otherwise you wouldn't have gotten this far. If you're going to me, the biggest stumbling block is just getting started. Sit down, take a piece of paper, start laying out your story, see where it takes you. It's not gonna be perfect, okay, from the very beginning. You're gonna go back and say, no, well, that didn't work, or I don't like the way this started. So you just take out another sheet of paper, start all over again, until you get to the point where you're happy with it, okay? And then you just keep going, say, oh, once you get into that flow, you're gonna see that the stories will just come out. It says, oh my gosh, I'm on a flow, I'm just going to keep going. And then you get to the point where, well, I'm stuck. What am I going to do for this? So you just go back and you fix it then. So to me, my advice to you is don't overthink it. Just do it. You're going to make mistakes, sure, but that allows you to grow. And then later on, you can always go back and say, oh, well, this didn't work out so well, so I'm going to go back and, retcon it or fix it or do whatever. It's your story. The beauty of comics, it's your world. You can have it do anything you want. You're not limited by budget. You're not limited by anything but your own imagination. Okay? If you want to draw a scene where you have 1,000 spaceships battling, unicorn knights, you You can do that. You're not limited by that. Okay? See, that's the beauty of comics. You know, you're not, like I said, you're not limited by budget. You're only limited by your own imagination. So you just go ahead and do it. Just sit down and do it.
All right, next question.
Speaking of starting at the beginning, what was it like for all three of you to start making your first comic? What were the methods you used, and do you feel like you did a good job on it?
So I was attempting to get work inking for one of the big publishers, and I did batch after batch after batch of samples. And my first thought was, you know, if I just had a story here, I'd be actually making my own comics. So I sat down and wrote a script, hired an artist, and then we started making black and white comics under the title Heroic Tales somewhere in the late 90s. Along the way, I met people that ended up being industry people. So I got to pitch to people at DC, or pitch to people at IDW, and those led to work. So, you know, it's comics, and there's really no barrier to entry. So you can just start. You know, part of it is you have to come out with a story with a beginning, middle, and end. When you get started, you finish something that. There's a world of difference between people who want to do something and people who do something, and that's just a certain amount of positive energy you put into the project.
That was excellently said. For me, it all started with, you know, I kind of came in later, right? I was starting to conceptualize this around 2020-ish before we put out our first book in 2022. So I'd always wanted to do it, but I was looking at the market. And I thought that there was a lot of opportunity there. And so I said, it's probably not going to be a better time than now. And I saved a bunch of money to make this happen. And I wanted to do it the ambitious way. And I don't know if that makes sense for everybody, because for sure not everybody has thousands of dollars just kind of laying around where they can kind of sink it into it. But for me, that's where it all started. And I think it worked really well because I was also working with veterans. So what I did was right before I, started the company, I was reaching out to just about everybody. And not all advice is going to be useful, but I was reaching out to any and everybody just to kind of see what advice that they had for me, and I did what made sense for me, and I discarded what didn't. And but having guys like me being more of a, not my first time writing something, but my first time doing it in this format. Of writing, and then having alongside me, Cliff Richards, who was a long time artist for pretty much both of the big major publishers, as well as the colorist, and Gabe El Taib, who same thing. He'd been coloring and drawing and for just about everybody. So we had the new mix with the veteran talent, and it just meshed very, 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 very well. But yeah, it started with we talk about the it's not really that complicated. One note for my Universe Bible, Word doc, and just type it away.
Well, there are two ways you can approach this. You can try to work for somebody else, okay? The advantage of that is that you get a steady paycheck, The problem with that is that it's difficult, Depending on who you decide to work with, you're going to have to deal with the gatekeepers, and you have to see if you can get work from them. Matt, you just explained, he sent samples, and it's hard to get work from other companies because they have, they have barriers to entry. Plus, if you work for somebody else, then you're beholden to somebody else. Okay, they tell you what to do. They tell you, oh, I don't like that. That needs to be changed. But I don't want to change it. Well, you work for me, so you have to change it. Okay? Now, but, like I said, the big advantage of that, steady paycheck. If that's what you want, then you can try that route. The other art is work for yourself. Eric is a perfect example of someone who works for himself. He made it himself. He controls everything, every aspect of it. Okay, if that's the route you want to take, you can do that, but it's a big risk. Okay, he's putting in his own money. You know, the success and failure of his project or any project, okay, is dependent on the project itself, you know, and your faith in that project. So if you're a risk taker and you want to take a chance on your own vision of what you want to do, you know, that's a route you can take. Nowadays, there's a lot of opportunity for people who, you know, don't have a lot of money to crowdfund their project. You know, that didn't used to be the case. You know, you had to go through distributors, retailers, and all that kind of stuff, and they were sort of gatekeepers too. You know, you had to convince them that your product was good enough that they'll really be willing to put it in their store. Okay, and there was a lot of that back in the day. So now, if you crowdfund it yourself, then the public decides, yes, I want to support this project. You know, and I'm going to support it with my money directly to you, you know, so that you can come out with this. Or now, of course, crowdfunding will take their cut. The way Eric has done it, he's done it directly to the consumer. So, you know, he doesn't have to deal, because crowdfunding sites, they're also gatekeepers. You know, they can tell you, now we're going to drop your project, or we're not going to take care of your project. You know, so that's something that that's a risk as well. You know, I think Eric's model is the future. You know, people direct to consumer. That's the way I think it's going to go. You know, the trouble is, it's a little bit more difficult. You know, but it's worth the effort. You know, if you can pull it off.
So, kind of going with that, the direct-to-consumer route. How did you market direct to consumer, Eric?
Yeah, so I obviously have been involved in creative projects. I mean, up until since I was a teenager. So I at least had like this kind of foundation. I had a baked-in audience, especially that was willing to give me a time of day. Knew me from being a musician and everything else. But my biggest thing was, you know, I could not make sense, and it was crazy how so many people were trying to funnel me to Diamond. But I couldn't make sense of it. More so, I was looking at it from I'm a finance guy, and I'm all about business. So I was looking at it from a financial aspect, and I was like, I can't make this make sense because I'm not doing it at that volume. I personally can't make it make sense. And then, you know, what happened with Diamond and everything that happened. So some of it was stubbornness. Tell people that all the time. Some of it was like I was hard-headed. I was like, I get that everybody's doing it this way, but I can't wrap my mind around it. If I have this audience and I at least have the money, most importantly, to build the infrastructure, why don't I just do that? And then I'm not having to worry about like the middleman, the gatekeepers, which I know both of these guys have been in the industry much longer than I have. I can imagine when they were coming up, just the amount of gatekeeping that they had to deal with. And you know, blessed growing up in this age, I didn't necessarily have to deal with it. I don't think I could have dealt with it, to be completely honest, at all. So I just did my own thing. But yes, it is very risky. This is why I don't want people to get tricked into believing that doing it exactly my way, you know, is the way. But yeah, there's something that you can for sure take for it and model it and make it unique to you. Definitely with the direct to consumer, because when you do that, I mean, nobody's getting any money off the top. Sure, you got to pay your artists and everything and the creators that are involved, but at least that margin, those profit margins are much larger than you going through someone else who's going through someone else, and also having to deal with the politics that are associated with that. So, you know, for me, I had a baked-in audience, and most importantly, I was savvy enough to know what I didn't know. So I would bring people in to try to solve those problems for me, and then that made for having a website and, you know, everything that I could take the model of what I saw people doing with crowdfunding, with the public numbers and everything, and then just make my own version of it, but going directly to my customers rather than selling to like the retailer, because I don't think that's what most people know about when you enter in, especially the direct market. Trade's a little different, but at least with the direct market, yes, there is, you know, you're collecting that data through a pre-order system, but for the most part, you're selling to another retailer. You're selling to someone who's selling it to someone else, right? You're not selling directly to your customer. So that's just why oftentimes, you know, some of those practices get a little questionable, because technically you're not their audience, right? Like they're selling it to the retailer. Once it got out of their hands, they're like, we made our money, you know. So it's a little different. It's way riskier, but it's worthwhile. I've worked harder right now than I ever have in my entire life, but I love everything about it.
That's awesome. It is really hard to be independent, and it's also hard to work for a big company. I had contacts in a big company. Once they were all fired, my work went away. When you make your own stuff, that doesn't happen.
All right. So another question. Okay. So question 1, then question 2, then 3. All right. Here you go. Question 1.
As creatives, what's the most frustrating thing you encounter most often, and how do you deal with it?
What was the question again?
As creatives, what's the most frustrating thing that you encounter most often, and how do you work through it or deal with it?
Well, for me personally, it's always been the business aspect of it, having to, find where the next amount of money you need to keep your business going. It's always been a biggest obstacle for any, as far as Antarctic Press is concerned. But we managed to be able to do it, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to do it.
Most frustrating thing, that's tough. Well, I think for me, definitely with kind of piggybacking on the last question that we were talking about with the D2C, there's just so much that goes into it. And for me, the most difficult thing was scale. We went from a 1,500 square foot warehouse day one that became obsolete like after the first day, because I went from I sell a few hundred books, we'll see what happens, to oh wow, we have sold tens of thousands of books, this warehouse ain't gonna do it, alongside all the shirts. Yeah, it's a good problem to have. It's a great problem to have, but like there's just so much negotiation that's involved with that scale, and when you start to operate at that scale, when I say literally everything, because you don't just, it's not like we're printing the physical books in-house, though who knows, maybe eventually we'll get to that point. But everything's up for negotiation. So I'm having to negotiate with the parcel companies. I got to negotiate with UPS, got to negotiate FedEx, got to even negotiate with USPS, making sure that I'm not getting the short end of the stick. I'm negotiating with our printers because I know our volume has increased. So, I'm having to get these deals, long-term deals kind of in place so that we're taken care of, and I'm having to negotiate with them all the time, having those those tough conversations of what you're having to do, and that's with every single aspect. My manufacturers, right, for my shirts, I'm negotiating with them about getting the lowest rates that we possibly can and trade for the amount of business that we're sending them. So scaling up was so difficult because none of that had been done before, right? I was doing everything out of the box. Basically, the prices that you pay when you go to USPS was the prices that we were paying, essentially, until that all changed. And so there's just so much that goes into scaling up that we had to kind of learn along the way. And there was a lot of failures along the way. Things that we were like, oh, this is gonna work, that didn't. And I had to say, you know what, okay, we're gonna make an adjustment. And you have to be flexible and nimble enough to do that. But scale for me was the just most difficult thing to have to deal with. And we're still dealing with it because the bigger we get, it's like it's new problems that get created.
I haven't had the issues of scale that you had, sadly. But I've had the other side of depression where you put a lot of time into a book and you love it, and it hits the market like an orphan and it just doesn't sell enough. That is pretty tough. A far, far, far distant second to frustrations about making comics are waiting for pages from really talented people. And saying, there's only so many polite ways to say, where are my effing pages? That's about it.
All right, next question.
All right, so this is a little convoluted, but with changing storytelling styles or mediums, between volumes or major events in the story potentially affect the viewer's experience. Like, for example, switching from a straightforward story to direct anthology.
Are you asking more so like how do we approach those different formats?
Yes, like one overarching story, but changing it from a mainline story to an anthology story.
I know Ben talked about some of this, yesterday when you could package things in a different way depending on how you wrote it. We've done pretty much all of them. I mean, we've done the shorter stories, we've done graphic novels, single issues, we've done anthologies like with several different writers, and they're all different. They're all unique and they're all different. And I think you just have to be mindful of that when you are creating, because they're not the same medium. And if you try to tell those stories in the same exact way, you might run into some problems. They're not even the same type of consumer, to be completely honest, because we get guys, for example, that prefer like the bigger, like we do, like our omnibus or something, and they prefer it in that format, right? They get the full story, and then you get others that don't like, they'll never touch that. They want single issues and what have you. So you kind of gotta know what's your long-term plan. It can be very difficult to see that, man. Like definitely when you're talking about repackaging material, but as far as individually, like an anthology versus a 15-page or a 20-page floppy, like those are different types of things, man. And you gotta approach it specific to that medium, if that makes sense.
I mean, I agree with it. It just depends what your vision is. It depends what your character is. It depends what your story is. What are you trying to aim for? If you have a character story that's character driven, put your characters in the stories that you want to have to say. If you're story driven, then focus on the story. It just depends on what you yourself trying to accomplish overall.
So it sort of depends on your publishing structure. I letter a lot of trade paperbacks, and I letter Dunn and Soul Finder graphic novels. And those come in somewhere between 60 and 80 pages. That is really hard to schedule if you're first going to do it as a comic book and a little thing with a staple in it. If you look at it, comics are a flow of information. They are 4 panels per page, so a 10-page story. You've got 40 images to tell your story with some text. Where you break it up makes it interesting, and where you break it up helps you sell it. It's just a question of how much you want to bite off all at once. If you want to do a 20-page story, you can get that done relatively quickly, but if you want to do an entire 120 pages, that's going to take you for a long time, and your art style may change by the time you get it done. So you really have to focus on things that are achievable, because success breeds success. It is really awkward to try to say, I've written these 3 novels and I've got the first chapter done. If you've got that first chapter done and you can release that and get some feedback on that, that will guide you through the rest of your project.
All right, so I think this is going to be our last question of the panel.
Okay, so say for your first issue, there was something that you wanted to reveal about a character, but then you decide to not do it. But then, like, the moment the book comes out, you regret making that decision for that certain revelation. Do you somehow naturally able to convey it in the second issue, or like future issues, even though it was like such an important part of that character that should have been revealed in that moment?
You can do that in a number of different ways, but I just want to make sure that anybody that's aspiring to create comics understand that the work has to get done. And so don't try to kill yourself by being a perfectionist and thinking like, oh, well, because you're always going to have that, man, I could have did this. I mean, I used to do it with this music. Man, we could have threw another bridge there at that given moment, and it would have made maybe the song a little better. You're going to have that with every single story that you put out, but you needed to get it out in the first place in order to get that feedback. So I wouldn't look at it as regret, because it can also happen the other way around. One of our most prominent characters is the Norfolk thing, and they were a throw-in in the first issue that I almost didn't put them in the book. And I'm glad I did. Like, they almost didn't. If you've read ISOM #1, you see that they come at the end and they're talking about their band and everything, and something's greater. That could have not. It wouldn't have changed ISOM's story at all if we would have left that out. Thankfully, we did, because it was people saw those characters and they were like, oh wow, we want everything. And now we've done music videos about the In-Universe band, and they got their own book and everything. So it's gonna work both ways. You're gonna have things that you wish you did. Then you're gonna have things that almost, it was a throw-in. It's like, just throw it in there, and then it becomes one of the best ideas that you had. And that's the awesome thing and the most humbling thing about doing comics or anything entertainment-wise with music as well. You may put out a song. I mean, I've had songs. We've had like "Be Great" is my band's Backwards, one of our biggest songs. It sounds nothing like the other one. We're more metalcore, and that was a more like a hardcore kind of song. And we put that out, and it's one of our most. I mean, we have to open with it because now everybody wants to hear it. So you're gonna have it happen both ways. Just don't hurt yourself in like trying to be a perfectionist. Like I wanted to convey it. If you didn't want it to convey it, and that was what you were feeling at the same time, maybe that was the best decision. But because at the end of the day, you have to get the work out.
I don't know. I mean, I agree with that. And the thing is that it's really depending on you as the writer. I mean, if you feel like you've left something out or want to change something, like Eric said, the beauty of comics is that you can fix that the next issue. And if you don't do it that issue, do it the next issue. So it's really up to you.
So if we're constantly improving, that means that we're smarter today than we were yesterday. So you have to cut yesterday's stuff a little bit of slack. In the Punchline series, I've got a cranky World War II veteran training a millennial kid. I knew that she was cranky. I didn't know how cranky. The first issue got done. In the second issue, she attempts to murder an old enemy with a really sharp knife. And somebody asked me, why didn't you put that in the first issue? I said, well, it occurred to me when I was writing the second one, that's why. I'm putting a fine point on it at that point. So, these things grow and they evolve. And your fifth story will put things in your fourth story in a brand new light. And you have to consider your information flow to your readers and how you manage expectations and fulfill what they're looking for.
All right, so let's finish out this panel with one short piece of advice from each of you for people who are still desiring to break into the industry. What is the one piece of advice? Let's start with Mr. July.
Do the work. One of the ways you can set yourself aside from everybody else, I mean, I've been working in the arts since I was a teenager, like I said. And being a workhorse is going to take you very, very far if you can just get the work done, because I promise you many of your competitors are slacking off somewhere. So don't beat yourself up, but get the work done. None of this matters if you're just kicking ideas all day long in your head. Put pen to pad, man. Get to work and actually do it. So if you feel decent about your story, you feel like it's in a decent spot, just actually go forth with it. Don't let that just be an idea that's kicking around for several years.
Very well said. The only thing I would probably add is that, if you have an idea in your head, it does you no good if it stays in your head. Okay? You have to put it onto something physical, and you have to share that with whoever you're going to share it with. Okay? Because you may have the best idea in the world locked in your head, but if you don't share it, it does you no good.
Wow. I think it's really hard to be a genius. That's why I've decided not to be one. The people that are working in comics, they're really good at their job. And if you want to be working for a mainstream publisher, the best thing you can do is build a really strong independent project. Because once you've demonstrated you can sell your comics, they know you can sell their comics. Or make connections like Ben. He's at his table over at Antarctic Press. Go by and say hi. But, it is very complicated selling comics and getting better. But it's like a journey of self-improvement. You go out there and you try to be a little better writer, a little more insightful, a little better in your figure drawing, a little cleaner in your color work. Whatever it takes to make comics a little bit better every day.
All right, give these gentlemen a round of applause, please, for the excellent advice. Thank you all so much, gentlemen. It's been excellent chatting with you all today.